How do you get started with listening in Mandarin? What makes group conversations so challenging? And is it true that news broadcasts in Chinese are harder than in other languages? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is a Q&A focusing on listening comprehension, and that is meant to set you up for June's listening challenge, which will start on June 10th. As usual, these challenges are completely free to join. Just head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com. This Q&A episode is also set to coincide with my course, The Fluent Listener, opening for registration. And to learn more about that, you can go to listening.hackingchinese.com. Listening is the most important skill of all when learning Chinese, and having good listening comprehension allows you to navigate conversations with ease, build deeper connections with people, learn about language and culture, excel at exams like HSK and TOCFL, use Mandarin confidently in professional contexts, and perhaps most importantly, accelerate progress in other areas, including speaking. It's important to take listening seriously as soon as possible, because there is an auspicious spiral here, and once you get it going, you will reap lots of benefits. If you listen more, you will understand more, and the more you understand, the more you will learn. And if you use the right approach, it's also possible to combine listening with other things you're doing, so it's possible to listen a lot, even if you lead a busy life. So if you're tired of being able to say things in Chinese but never understanding what people say back to you, or you just want to upgrade your listening comprehension in general, go check out my course, The Fluent Listener. Okay, let's get to the Q&A, and as usual, I've picked 3 student questions that I'm going to answer in this episode. The first question is about beginner listening, and more specifically, how to get started. The second one is about group conversations and why they are so difficult to understand. And the third one is if listening to news broadcasts in Chinese really is harder than in other languages. So let's get started with question number 1, which is from Elizabeth, and she wants to know how she, as a beginner, can get started with listening in Chinese. She says that anything she listens to seems too hard, and even listening to her textbook is difficult if she hasn't read the content in advance. This is indeed a common experience, and I think most students feel like that when they set out. If you listen to anything you haven't read or prepared in advance, it simply seems too difficult. This is because most words are unfamiliar, and unlike when listening to, say, Spanish, you can not rely on words sounding the same, so unless you have a lot of visual support, it's literally impossible to understand even beginner content unless you've studied it in advance. The fact that most listening content will be too hard doesn't mean it's impossible to create listening content that a pure beginner can understand, though. It just means that most people don't, and your textbook is certainly not an example of this. Like I said, for things to be comprehensible as a pure beginner, you need to have some kind of support, and visual support is the easiest here. So that means that you need videos to understand what's going on. I have previously published an article on Hacking Chinese where I recommend YouTube channels that are entirely in Chinese or almost entirely in Chinese for learners on all levels. And this includes a category for zero beginners, meaning that you can pick some of these videos up literally with knowing no Chinese at all. The creators of these videos have lots of experience teaching beginners Chinese without going through English, and when they do this, they will rely on pictures, they will rely on body language, and sometimes on translation, but rarely. If you've never checked content like that, I strongly suggest that you do, and this is how I also suggest that you as a beginner get started with listening. It's perfectly fine to also listen to things in your textbook, such as the dialogues, etc., or listening to the audio for a graded reader you're working your way through, or similar, but I think this type of comprehensible input videos, focusing on pure beginners, is the best place to start. They don't require you to do anything, they don't require you to have studied any vocabulary or grammar and so on before you get started. You can literally do this day 1 you're learning Mandarin. If this is not day 1 learning Mandarin, but you still consider yourself a beginner, I did provide lots of recommendations for more YouTube channels in the same article I just referred to, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Anyway, to summarize, listening is something you should just dive straight into. It requires you to know what content to pick, but since I've already collected the best resources for zero beginners, that's where you should go, and that's how you get started. You can also check out my course, The Fluent Listener, that I mentioned in the introduction, because there I have a resource library which is tagged and sorted by difficulty, so you can find content that suits your level, no matter if you're a beginner or more advanced student. Let's move on to question number 2, which is from Kevin, who wants to know why group conversations with native speakers are so hard. And essentially, he describes a situation where he hangs out with Chinese-speaking people in his home country, not in a Chinese-speaking country. And even though he thinks his listening ability is pretty good in general, he finds it impossible to keep track of what's going on, and he feels like a beginner again. I think group conversations are very interesting, and I agree with Kevin that they can be very challenging. I remember back in 2010 when I returned from Taiwan after having lived there for 2 years, and I hung out a lot with Taiwanese exchange students in Sweden, and it was quite challenging to follow along with social conversations in small groups, whereas I felt fairly confident talking with individuals one at a time. This topic is very interesting, and I plan to return to it a little bit more in next week's episode, so stay tuned for that, but I will of course try to answer Kevin's question here. There are several reasons why group conversations with native speakers are hard, and I'm going to assume here that the content itself might not be the problem, so if you were to speak with one of these people individually, you would understand what they said. It's the group part that's the problem. Naturally, having more than one speaker in the conversation makes it harder to understand because people talk over each other. Maybe they talk a little bit more quickly when there are other native speakers involved and you are not the only recipient of what they're saying, and this leads to a larger or heavier cognitive load in general. Another important thing to keep in mind is that when you're talking with one person, they have you as their only target audience when they say something, but in a group they are addressing several people at once, and maybe they will tend to adapt to the average of that group, and since you might be the only foreigner here, that makes it very difficult because, well, they are basically addressing other native speakers. They assume that they know certain things, and I'm not only talking about words, grammar, and so on, I'm talking about cultural references to current events, or maybe just something that happened yesterday that you don't know about. When you're talking with a single native speaker one-on-one, they will maybe be more cognizant of these references and try to explain them to you, or at least they will notice that your facial expression signals that you didn't understand something. But in a group conversation, they have many things to pay attention to, and you are just one of them, so the likelihood that they will adjust to you specifically is much lower. Another reason group discussions can be difficult to follow is that when people talk naturally and casually in a group, they switch topics all the time, and they don't do so by clearly signaling that now we're going to change topics, we're going to talk about this instead of that. This means that it might take a while before you realize that they are actually talking about something completely different. They used to be talking about this movie, but now they are suddenly talking about ice cream. And if you didn't catch that change in topic, it will be very difficult to use top-down listening strategies. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about here, I will link to an article from my series Beyond Tingbudong, where I talk about top-down listening strategies, but essentially it is about using what you already know to understand what you hear. So essentially using your knowledge about what they might say, your ability to predict what somebody might discuss and so on, to make it easier to parse what they are actually saying. But the problem then is, of course, if you have no clue what they're saying, or you think they are talking about one topic, but they are actually talking about something else, you can't use these strategies, and successful listening relies on top-down listening. But like I said, there is a podcast and article about this already, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. So what's my advice to Kevin here? How should he practice to make it easier to follow these conversations? Well, first you should listen more, because the more you listen, the more fluent you will become. This means that you will hear words in different contexts over and over, and when you're able to make sense of them and connect the spoken sound to their meaning, you will do this faster every time. This is important because the faster you recall words and the less focus you need to do so, the more cognitive resources you have left over to focus on other things in the conversation, such as what topic people are talking about and when they are changing topics, for example. So even if I think that listening more is the answer to most questions related to listening, there are a few things you can try that are more specifically about group conversations. First and foremost, I think you should make an inventory of things you listen to normally and see, are they also group conversations, or are they perhaps mostly monologues or maybe even scripted content? If you're normally only listening to one person speaking at a time with you as their only audience, or maybe with a general audience in mind, then you're not practicing the things you need to deal with group conversations. Fortunately, there are many podcasts in Chinese, including podcasts for learners, where people speak Chinese in groups, and since this is what you want to practice, it makes sense listening to those podcasts. My favorite example of this is probably Dashu Mandarin, and they are usually 3 people in each episode, and sometimes even more, and that is an excellent way of practicing less scripted, more spontaneous group conversations. As mentioned for an earlier question, I do have an article covering the best podcasts for learning Chinese on different levels, so if Dashu Mandarin is too hard for you, check out the link in the show notes for more recommendations. This brings us to the third question, which is from a student with the username Amiga666, which is about listening to news broadcasts in Chinese. And what they're asking here is if it really is the case that listening to news is harder in Chinese than in other languages, or if it just feels like that. This is an interesting question I think I should return to in an upcoming episode, but let's summarize a few interesting observations here at least. When looking at the descriptors for each level of listening ability according to the Central European Framework of Reference for Languages, that's the A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2 scale, it seems a little bit odd that news are mentioned so early. For example, if you look under the category for listening, where it says watching TV, film and video, we can see that news are mentioned from A1, where it says recognize familiar words and phrases and identify the topics in headline news summaries. I have never met a student at the A1 level who can do this, so this seems definitely like it should be harder in Chinese than the other languages that this framework was created for. On the A2 level, we have identified the main points of TV news, which also seems exceedingly hard to do at such a beginner level. As we move up the levels, we are required to understand more, of course, and at B2 it says understand most TV news and current affairs programs. And I would say that this is also harder in Chinese than it is in, say, English, French, or Spanish. For the fluent listener, I created a self-assessment resource where you can try to use the CFR levels to figure out where your listening is at the moment. And when I did that, I had to leave notes for this specific one on B2, saying that this is not really realistic if you're on a B2 level, and that this probably requires more like a C1 level to actually understand most TV news and current affairs programs. There might be many reasons for this, and since I haven't investigated this quantitatively and I haven't found any research that does that either, this will mostly be my own observations, but I do have a few ideas why listening to news in Chinese is so hard. First and foremost, I think that news in Chinese is primarily written formal Chinese read aloud. And written formal Chinese is condensed, uses a lot of abbreviations, and is generally quite dense in information. And that means that when you read it aloud, you get a lot of information per second or per syllable or however you count it. News broadcasts are also delivered fairly rapidly in Chinese, and so if your listening speed is not up to par, you will fall behind fairly quickly. Another problem might be contextual or cultural references that you're missing. So, for example, when you listen to news in French, if you're a native speaker of English, you might know many of the topics that they refer to and you have largely the same cultural references. But if you listen to Chinese news, you're unlikely to know as much as about what's going on in China compared to, say, France if you're learning French. And that means that it will be difficult to understand the topics for this reason. You lack a certain amount of prior knowledge. Of course, this will be easier if you listen to Chinese news all the time, because then you will know what happened last week and last month, and you will be able to connect what's happening now to what happened back then. But if you just got started with news, this can be a major hurdle. I also think that in many Western countries, there is a conscious effort to make news as accessible as possible, not necessarily for non-native speakers, but just to make sure that people who listen to or watch mainstream news can figure out and follow what's going on. Whereas in Chinese, like I said, it's mostly formal written Chinese simply read aloud, and this is much harder to understand than somebody talking about the same topic. There might be other reasons news broadcasts are difficult to understand in Chinese, and if you have any suggestions, please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment, and maybe I'll write a follow-up article and record an episode only about this later. So what should you do if you want to understand news then? Well, one thing is, of course, to listen to more news, but I also think that reading news will be helpful here. I think the main problem is the language here. Like I said, it's written formal Chinese, and if you have very little exposure to written formal Chinese in writing, it's going to be even harder to understand it when it's read aloud quickly. It can also pay off to focus on topics that you already know. So, for example, listening to international affairs in Chinese is significantly easier than listening to local news, because at least you know the context there, or you can access it through some other language. Another idea is to use narrow listening, so you focus on one news event, and then you listen to different news broadcasts about the same thing. When you listen to the first one, it's going to be hard. When you listen to the second one, it's going to be slightly easier because you know some of the words, or you know what it's about at least. And when you listen to the fifth, it might even feel easy. Another suggestion is that you don't only listen to the news, you should watch them as well, because having pictures showing what they are talking about makes it much easier to understand. Listening to radio news in Chinese really is quite hard, and just to confirm Juan's suspicion here, it's my personal observation that listening to broadcasts in Chinese is significantly harder than listening to the same type of broadcasts in, say, English or Swedish or French. Okay, that means we have now discussed the 3 questions that were on the menu for today. So what remains is to wish you good luck in the listening challenge, and I also hope to see you in the Fluent Listener, which is open for registration until next Thursday. If you're listening to this in the future, you can still head over to listening.hackingchinese.com to see the availability of the course, and if it's closed, you can leave your email address so I can notify you when the course opens again. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.